What is up, my beautiful gemstones? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, but today we are going to be discussing the Keddie cabin murders case. I wasn't sure if I was going to put 2 videos out this week in the interest of my mental health and desperately needing a break, which I am taking, but I'll only be missing 1 week of pre-recorded uploads on April 8th, and I won't be attending Afternoon Talk on April 2nd. I just need some time to decompress and didn't know if I would have the time or the energy to put the effort into writing 2 videos and everything else that goes into them. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, guys, and I am only one person. I am the only one that does anything involving my channel for the most part. However, I was thinking when I cover true crime here on this channel, instead of delving into the paranormal, at least in the last 2 years or so, I normally do overviews because whenever I tried to do deep dives and the videos had 3 or 4 parts, because there was so much information, people hated it. They absolutely hated it, and they balked and complained that the videos were too long and that the information was too deep. So I found a case in my notes that I've been wanting to discuss with you all for some time now, but other things just kept coming up. What better way to leave for my break than to do it with discussing the very bizarre and mysterious Keddie cabin murders? As I said, guys, this started off as it was just going to be an overview of the case. I was going to give you all the general information, tell you, listen, if you want more, if you have questions, research on your own. But that is not the way my mind works, and that is just not the way I am able to bring myself to do things. So I did manage to condense it to get it down into the one video of kind of average length, maybe a tiny bit longer, but I do still suggest that if you guys still have unanswered questions by the end of it, always do your own research and look into things for yourselves. With all of that being said, let's jump right in, because this one is a doozy. It was July of 1979, and Glenna Susan Sharp had separated from her very abusive husband, James Sharp. Sue, as she was called by her friends and family, knew it was time for she and her children to have a fresh start at life, and she felt good about the breakup. Obviously, her abusive ex, James, wasn't too happy, but there was nothing that he could do once Sue decided to break the cycle of violence and really try to gain a better life for herself and her children. Sue moved from Connecticut, where she and James had lived as a family with the kids, to Northern California, and she brought her 5 children with her. Her kids were her 15-year-old son, John, her 14-year-old daughter, Sheila, her 12-year-old daughter, Tina, and her 2 youngest boys, 10-year-old Rick and 5-year-old Greg. That sounds like a lot of kids, but they stayed with their mom, and I'm sure they were very happy to be outside of that abusive situation finally. Eventually, after staying with Sue's brother for a little while, the family eventually settled in the quaint and very rural resort town of Keddie, California, which is located in the Sierra Nevada mountains. She rented a cabin, and the whole family seemed to enjoy the peace, quiet, and freedom that cabin life brought to them. It was stable, and it was beautiful. Unfortunately, though, all of their dreams and hopes for a bright future and a new life would be cut horribly short, and they had no way of knowing when they settled there that they would become the subject of one of the most gruesome and mysterious unsolved murder cases in California's history. On the night of April 11th, 1981, Sheila went to her friend's house for the night in order to have a sleepover, which is nothing unusual for a 14-year-old girl to do. On that same night, 10-year-old Rick's friend, Justin Smart, came over to spend the night in the family's cabin, which was cabin number 28. 15-year-old John and his friend Dana Hall Wingate had decided to hitchhike out to the town of Quincy in order to meet up with some friends, and once they returned, Dana also ended up staying the night at the cabin as well. The next day was perfectly normal and nothing unusual seemed to be happening when at 7 a.m., young Sheila walked back from one of the other cabins where she had been staying, so right in the area, to her home to go inside and start her day. Her sleepover was over. She wanted to be home with her family. Outside of the cabin, nothing was amiss, nothing seemed unusual. It wasn't until she let herself in that she would be greeted with a macabre scene straight from the worst type of horror movie you could imagine. The lights were all off and the cabin seemed somewhat gloomy, and before she stumbled across the dead bodies of her family and the bloody scene before her, she got the immediate and intense feeling that something terrible had happened. In the living room, Sheila saw John, Dana, and her mother Sue all bound with tape and cords, lying in pools of their own blood. Obviously, this 14-year-old girl was in a panic, so she ran out of the house to go to another cabin, a neighboring cabin, to try and get some help. Her younger brothers were found in an adjacent room, along with Rick's friend Justin Smart, alive and well and sleeping soundly until they were walked in on and woken up. The only one left was Tina, and she was nowhere to be found. The authorities were notified and showed up relatively quickly. They noticed right away that the murder seemed to have been overtly brutal and vicious, and they found various clues in the residence as well. Sue, John, and Dana had not only been bound, but they'd all been viciously stabbed and bludgeoned with a hammer. Most of the murder weapons were actually left behind in the living room with them. One of the knives had been used so ferociously that it was bent out of shape in several places. Upon further inspection of the bodies, more strange clues would surface. Sue was found lying on her side next to the sofa, and she was half naked from the waist up. She had been gagged with a blue bandana, and her own panties had been stuffed into her mouth as well. Her mouth was bound with electrical tape, and her body had been covered with a yellow blanket. Her throat had been slit wide open. She had been stabbed in the chest, and she had a wound on her head that was thought to have been caused by some sort of blunt object, and it looked to police it could have been the butt of a BB gun. John Sharp had been bound at his wrist and his ankles with medical tape and electrical cord, and his throat was also slit. Dana, who had multiple head injuries, was found with his face down in a pillow. He had been stabbed multiple times and manually strangled as well. It was complete and total overkill by all accounts and in each case. Dana had been bound like the others with medical tape and electrical cord, but his feet were tied with a cord that connected to John's bindings. Tons of blood was found on the sheets in Tina's room, but she still had not been located, and there was no sign of her anywhere. For some strange and unknown reason, the walls had also been stabbed many times and all over the place, and there was a shoe print found outside. Nothing was stolen from the cabin, but Tina's jacket and shoes were missing, as well as a toolbox. One of the hammers thought to have been used in the murders was missing as well. The telephone had been taken off the hook, and the curtains had all been drawn. Right away, the authorities came to the conclusion that more than one person had to have been responsible for these murders. However, once they spoke to the neighbors, and let me explain that all the cabins were fairly close together, they found that no one had really seen or heard anything unusual the night before. There were some witnesses who said they thought they could have heard some muffled screaming maybe the night before, but they weren't really sure, and some people said they saw an unfamiliar green van in the area. The clues were sparse, and they led nowhere. The police interviewed the boys who had survived and got a bit more information from them. Now, guys, I'm in overview mode right now. I do eventually have enough and end up deep diving, so I will come back to some of these details that may not make a lot of sense right now. It's just the way I formed the video is a little different than I normally do. At some point, Justin had come forward and admitted that he had dreamt of the crime having happened. Later on, he would be put under hypnosis, and that's when it was found out that he had actually more than likely witnessed the murders. He told the police he had seen Sue arguing with two strange men in the cabin, and that one of them had a mustache and short hair. The other man was described as clean-shaven with long hair, and both of them had been wearing glasses. Then the men had taken Tina somehow, and the police thought this was a great lead. I mean, they really jumped all over this. They had composite sketches drawn up based on Justin's testimony, and they were widely distributed but turned up no new leads. For some strange reason, the police had an amateur sketch artist do the renderings, and the artist, whose name was Harlan Embry, had absolutely no formal training in forensic sketching. Obviously, rumors flew, and speculation was rampant about what had happened in the tiny and usually sleepy community of Keddie. It was a small cabin community, and things like multiple murders, they just didn't happen there. Some of the rumors were crazy, as rumors sometimes are, with people saying that the murders had been committed as a sort of satanic ritual sacrifice. Remember, it was 1981, the whole satanic panic thing. Others said it was a targeted professional hit, while still others claimed it more than likely had to do with drugs. Police found no evidence for anything like that in their investigation, though, and none of those things turned out to be true as far as anyone could tell. Somehow, the investigators also ruled out it having been the work of a serial killer, and all this time they were still looking for and hadn't found 12-year-old Tina. She was still missing. A massive search turned up nothing in that area, and it took more than 3 years for any clues as to her whereabouts would turn up. In April of 1984, a piece of a human skull and a part of a mandible were found in an extremely isolated area of woods on the outskirts of Butte County. That's about 100 miles away from Keddie and the cabin where it all took place. Those bone fragments were found to belong to the 12-year-old little girl. Nearby to the remains, they found a blue nylon jacket, a pair of Levi's jeans with a missing back pocket, a blanket, and an empty surgical tape dispenser. The rest of her body was never found to this day, and still no one knows how her remains ended up there. Over the next few years, the police did pursue several leads and interviewed several possible suspects. One was a man named Martin Smart, who was the stepfather of Justin Smart, one of the boys in the cabin on the night of the murders who had survived. Justin was the boy who, under hypnosis, suddenly remembered details, and it was his descriptions that the sketches would be made from. Martin Smart was someone who was known to have had some issues with Sue, and right around the time of the murder, he had reported that a hammer, of all things, had gone missing from his home. For years, there would be no new leads or clues. And in 2018, there were some things that came up in the investigation. This is kind of where my source material ended. And it's like, oh, that's the case of the Keddie cabin murder. So that was the overview. I couldn't have that. As you guys know, you know me, like, no, we could not have that. Keep in mind, please, that there is a ton of misinformation and just flat out lies out there, specifically on the internet, where anyone can write or claim anything they want as facts and have people believe them without any sort of proof or tangible evidence, particularly pertaining to this case, or so it seems. That seems to be the case, in my opinion, with true crime in general, which is why I've steered away from it for the most part in the last 3 years. Just keep it in mind and know I've done my very best to be as diligent as possible in the information I presented and that I'm about to present to you all. But even though I have the best intentions, I also only have the internet as source material on this, meaning I apologize if I get things wrong or make too many mistakes. With that being said, I absolutely had to dive deeper. Like, this doesn't make any sense to me. I've got to get more information. So here it is, okay? Here is the whole entire case of the Keddie cabin murders. And the reason I started this out the way I did is because that is the basic information you will get if you look up this case, and, you know, you're expected to just take it and go, and that's fine. But we needed more. We're gemstones. We needed more. We want all the details. So let's jump into it again. Keddie was a very popular railroad terminal in the Sierra Nevada mountains way back in the day, but it lost most of its population after the railroad closed. And even though it tried to reinvent itself as a resort town that catered to recreational camping and hiking, that didn't seem to work very well either. And the owner of the so-called resort area, those cabins, was a man named Gary Molleth. Gary finally chose to just turn the series of cabins into low-income rentals. It became a sort of little community all its own after that. Sue's abusive ex-husband had been in the military when they got divorced, and she got a stipend of $250 a month so that she could go and start a new life with her kids. She worked part-time at the Quincy Elks Lodge while living with her brother in Quincy, and that's how she ended up being able to rent cabin number 28 for her and her 5 kids in the fall of 1981. It was really important to Sue that she provide a stable home for her kids, especially after everything all 6 of them had been through at the hands of her ex-husband, and she really was hopeful that this would be a great brand new start for her family. Sue was always trying to better her situation, and so she started taking a typing class with the help of some financial aid she had qualified for. When interviewed after the murders, her neighbors said she was quiet and she kept to herself, but that the family seemed to be integrating very well into the little community. They were described as a nice family, and the children all attended school in Quincy and were doing well there too and making lots of friends. Just to run through a little layout of the cabin so that you can think about it as I go more deep into the crime. The front door opened into the living room, and beyond that was the kitchen and then the 2 bedrooms. The girls shared a room, and the younger boy shared the other one. Her eldest son, 15-year-old John, got to have the entire basement floor all to himself as his own personal space, and from the ground level in the back of the house, 1 flight of stairs led to the main area I just described to you all. It was small, but it was cozy, and it was better than the situation with the ex-husband. On April 11th, before the murders took place, the kids were in and out of the cabin all day, and everything was perfectly normal. Sometimes Justin is also called Justin Eason, because if you remember, Martin Smart was his stepfather, and I'm still unsure now, after all of this research, what his last name was. Was it Smart, like his stepfather's, or was it Eason? But just know, if you look into the case, that Justin is the same guy. He was a friend from the neighborhood, and that's how he met the family and made friends with the kids. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Sue and her oldest daughter, Sheila, were the ones who went to pick up John and his friend Dana in Quincy to bring them back home to the cabin, and that's when Dana decided to spend the night. At 3:30, John and Dana went out again, and that's when they hitchhiked, which Sue begged them not to do, knowing how dangerous it was. Even back then, or I should say in hindsight, especially back then in 1981, right? A witness later came forward and said they had seen the two young men on a corner trying to thumb a ride home anyways at about 9:30 or 10 that evening. Sue spent the later part of the afternoon with Tina and Sheila, and then the two girls went next door to cabin number 27 to hang out and watch TV with the Seabolt family. This is where Sheila had ended up spending the night with the Seabolts right next door, but Tina didn't want to stay and went home instead. Sheila ran back to the Seabolts when she found the massacre at 7 the next morning, and their son went to cabin 28 to see what was going on and to see if anyone had survived, all while his parents tried to comfort the girl. His name was Jamie Seabolt, and he is the one who found Rick, Greg, and their friend Justin alive and still asleep in the bedroom at the back of the house. They all seemed to genuinely have no idea what in the world had happened, just 2 rooms away from them while they slept. Jamie, thinking quickly, and I'm so grateful to him for this, knew how traumatizing and devastating the scene outside of the bedroom would be, especially for boys so young, and so he made them go out of the bedroom window so they didn't have to see any of the carnage themselves. The police didn't arrive as quickly as I had initially thought, but that could just be because of the very rural location. And an hour after Sheila had initially discovered the scene, at 8 a.m., the cops showed up and started their investigation. Though Sue was naked from the waist down, there were no signs of sexual assault. Blood patterns did indicate, though, that her legs were initially spread apart, sort of splayed, if you will, and I really hate that word. Someone moved her body from where she was initially slaughtered and covered her up with a yellow blanket. It turns out the boys' bodies had also been moved at some point as well. Given the extreme brutality of all of the murders, it's obvious why there was a lot of evidence left behind at the scene. One of the weapons was a steak knife that had come from Sue's kitchen. There was also the aforementioned hammer, 2 other bloody knives, and a plastic piece from a BB gun, which, if you remember, is what they thought one of them had been bashed in the head with. They also found a bloody fingerprint on a handrail that led down from the back door. Blood was not only all over the victims, but it was also all over the walls, the floors, the ceiling, both bedroom doors, and on the railing outside on the stairs as well. However, none of that blood seemed to belong to any perpetrators. All of it belonged to the victims. That's a bit unbelievable, but I'm pretty sure that's true. It's also unfortunate and probably one of the many reasons this case still isn't solved today. If the killer or killers had suffered any injuries, which they usually do when knives are involved, they couldn't have had anything serious happen, and they certainly didn't leave behind any evidence, as I already said. DNA was found left on a piece of tape, though, and it wasn't that of any of the victims. So, with all that blood, the only DNA found of the killer or killers was on a piece of tape. It actually took the police several hours to realize that Tina was missing, but at the end of the day, there were 6 kids total to be accounted for, and the whole place was a very chaotic mess of a crime scene. Police believed, due to all the bloodstains on her bed, that she had been kidnapped from her bed after the murders had already been committed. Unfortunately, though, so much time, several hours, had passed already since she had been taken, and the police, though hopeful, knew that the chances of finding her were getting slimmer by the second. The neighbors who reported hearing muffled screams between 1 and 2 in the morning just went back to sleep because they couldn't figure out what the sounds were or where they were coming from. The authorities thought it seemed highly unlikely, if not impossible, that the boys who survived slept through the incident because of how gruesome and violent it was. Also, they knew the murderer or the murderers had to have known that there were 3 additional children in the home when they committed the crimes, and the theory was that someone or something interrupted the crime before they'd had a chance to finish the job, so to speak, and kill the 3 boys. It wasn't until later that they learned not all of the boys were actually asleep, and that's when Justin came forward with his story of a dream that was later found to have actually happened through hypnosis. It was obvious from the moment they started investigating the scene that Sue specifically had fought bravely against the vicious attack, and that she fought for the lives of her children and herself, but neither John nor Dana had any defensive wounds or blood underneath their bindings. More than likely, that meant that the 2 young men probably hadn't had a chance to fight back, and it was also evident that all of their injuries happened after they had already been bound and tied. The investigation also confirmed that the weapons that were used on the victims' heads were 2 different hammers and a BB gun in Sue's case due to the blunt force trauma. In fact, the plastic piece the police found in the cabin that they contributed to Sue's horrific death was found to have come from a Daisy 880 BB gun specifically. The same exact gun also matched the impressions of the butt of the gun that were left in her skull. Guys, there was a multitude of evidence here, as you can imagine, I'm sure. But despite that and the numerous suspects found in this case, not a single arrest has ever been made. It's a well-known fact that the investigators failed to log a ton of the evidence and flat out ignored seemingly great leads. There are people still to this day who feel the police were either incredibly incompetent or that they purposely covered up this murder for some unknown reason. I certainly don't ever put it past any police department to be corrupt, but the first thing I thought was how this was such a shocking case and so far out of the norm for that tiny little cabin community and the rural areas that surrounded it, and how would such a small police force be able to handle such a massive and important case? Would they have the resources? I specifically delved deeper into this to try to get the most accurate evidence and information possible, and I really don't want to get into the still very rampant speculation about that because at the end of the day, speculation and rumor is all that it is at this point, but I did come up with some interesting facts, which we'll talk about as we go through the rest of this. So here's where things got very bizarre for me. When I first learned that kid Justin allegedly having dreamt about the murders and then being hypnotized, in the overview I read of the case, it went from one thing to another and didn't really make much sense, as I'm sure some of you might have realized, as I then relayed the information to you in the exact same manner in the beginning of this video. Once I looked a little below the surface, though, I understood better how that whole situation had played out. So about a month after the murders took place, Justin started telling his therapist that he had been having some terrifying and strange dreams about the murders. He said that in his dream, he had been trying to stop the bleeding in Sue's chest by putting pressure on the wounds with towels. He then said he dreamt he had covered her with a yellow blanket once he realized he couldn't have saved her and she was already dead. They figured something had to have happened, that he actually did wake up and end up doing the things he described having done in his dream, because she was covered with a yellow blanket, her body was moved, and it did look like somebody had tried at least a little bit to stop the bleeding. So that's why and when he was put under hypnotic regression. He said under hypnosis that he had been watching television in the boys' room just before he'd fallen asleep. He started to hear strange noises and loud bangs coming from out in the living room, and when he went out to see what was going on, he claims he saw Sue. That's when he saw her arguing there with two men. One man was tall with blonde hair and a mustache, and the other was shorter with dark hair and his face was clean shaven. Both were wearing glasses, as I already stated. He also remembered that the two older boys, John and Dana, had come home while Sue was in the middle of talking or arguing with those men. I say talking or arguing because sources seem to be all over the place and really split down the middle with how Sue and the men were interacting at that point. Somehow and in some way, violence and chaos suddenly erupted, and that's what resulted in the murders. I really wish there was more information about that regression and what else Justin said about what happened right before the chaos ensued, but I couldn't find anything that I felt was really reputable about that. As many of you know, I'm not the best at adding photos and videos and things like that to my videos, and I get a lot of flack for it, but with that being said, please go and check out the composites for this case. Okay, just please go composites of Keddie cabin murder suspects. It's absolutely ridiculous. They look like they were cartooned in a way. Justin also said something that didn't make a lot of sense to me, but that most people seem to take at face value. He said that not too long after the violence erupted in the living room, Tina came out of her room and that one of the men then abducted her out the back door at that time. How is that possible with all the blood that was found on her sheets? Granted, the amount of blood found on her bed varies greatly depending on the source, but they all at least agreed that there was enough blood on her bed to know that she had been taken from her room from that bed. Again, if I could find the tapes or some sort of actual record of what was said during that hypnosis session or during the sessions, because I don't even know how many of them there were, I think there was only one, but who knows, then maybe I could make more of a reasonable assessment. I believe wholeheartedly she was taken from her bed because there would have been no blood or other evidence in her room if they had just dragged her out the back door after she stepped out of her room. Why would they have even gone in there? Nothing was stolen besides her. I was really disappointed and very surprised that the information wasn't easily accessible, especially to someone like me with how accustomed I've become to jumping headfirst into rabbit holes and researching things like this. Just because I don't cover true crime that much on my channel doesn't mean I don't research it constantly and almost obsessively. Some people do say, though, that Justin could have easily gotten the information he said he was dreaming about from the 4 weeks in between when he came forward and when the case had actually happened, from the newspapers who were covering it on the front page widely every single day. But how would that account for his being hypnotized? I don't believe someone as young as him, before the age of the internet we now live in, would have known how to fake being put under hypnosis. That's just my opinion, though, guys. There are many people who say that they've heard the tapes and that the police made a lot of suggestive statements to the very susceptible young man during the session. So why were the police allowed to say anything during the hypnosis sessions? That's beyond me. And it's unbelievable how badly they both screwed the pooch with this case from the very beginning. And again, that they allowed the hypnosis to happen, but then had to be up front and center asking questions. Were they trained hypnotists or hypnotherapists? That makes the evidence gone right there. It's like null now, because they could have made suggestive statements to this poor kid. Knowingly or unknowingly, they could have done it completely by accident. But I found out some things later on, which I'll go over with you, that makes me feel like a lot of the police that were involved in this knew exactly what they were doing. As far as Tina's concerned, she is believed to have been there when the murders happened, and it's a known fact that she was in fact taken either during or after the murders took place. More than likely it was after, but that's just the main view of the collective at this point, and almost nothing has been able to be proven, even after all these years later, about what really went down that night in cabin number 28. A man named Robert Pedrini said he was out collecting cans in the woods approximately 90 miles southwest of Keddie when he found human remains. Those were the mandible and the skull piece that eventually were linked to young Tina. Initially, though, the investigators didn't make any connections with that and just thought it was some bones of a Native American person. That's what they said. They thought the bones belonged to a deceased Native American person. But an anonymous call to the sheriff at that time changed everything. The anonymous caller said that the remains did belong to Tina Sharp, and 2 months later, a forensic examination of the teeth confirmed that the anonymous source was right. Near those bones, I already discussed with you guys the other things that were found that were known to have belonged to Tina, but none of the evidence at the scene or anywhere near it helped investigators get any closer to identifying who committed these murders. It turns out there was someone who matched the description of one of the men that Justin gave for the composite sketches. Oddly enough, it was his stepfather, Martin Smart, and he became the prime suspect in the investigation for about 2 seconds. He went by Marty, and he and his wife Marilyn, along with her 2 sons, lived in cabin 26. That was just across the little lane from where the Sharps lived when they were slaughtered. Marilyn and Marty were taking the same typing class that Sue had enrolled in, and that's probably how they met. Most people describe Marty as having a really horrible and explosive temper, and as him being an unsavory individual. He admitted he could become violent and had trouble controlling his anger, and Marilyn claimed that he had once even tried to run over her and one of her sons when he was angry during a very small argument. During his interrogation, he told the police that he had a hammer that had gone missing with a blue handle, and he told them he thought his stepson Justin had seen something that night without the killer seeing or noticing him. Investigators ignored those statements completely, and they never arrested him. They also only interviewed him 1 time, and that was it. After that, he left Keddie and went to Reno, and then he moved to Oregon, and this source said he died in the year 2000. Another source said 2006, so the early 2000s the man passed away. Regardless of when he died, he took anything he knew or that he might have been guilty of to the grave with him. It came to light later on down the line that Marty had personal ties to and was a close personal friend of the sheriff at the time, a man named Doug Thomas. More so than that, he not only confessed in a letter to his wife Marilyn, but also he confessed a second time. The source material said he confessed to, quote, no less than 2 people, end quote, that he had indeed committed these murders. For whatever reason, more than likely his close ties to the sheriff, but who knows, the police basically pushed his confessions under the rug. Didn't want to deal with them. They didn't ask him about why he would confess or anything like that because they only interviewed/interrogated him that 1 time, and that was it. So even after information surfaced about his having made those confessions, the police never revisited their investigation into him and the claims he had made regarding the murders. In 2016, there were some new discoveries that seemed to reignite this case, and only then did it come out about Marty's multiple confessions. Marty had a counselor at a place he attended often called the Veterans Administration in Reno, who told authorities that he had confessed that he had killed Sue, but not Dana and John. According to that confession, Marty admitted he had been angry that Sue had convinced his wife Marilyn to leave him due to the abuse he was putting her and her children through. Now remember, guys, Sue had just left her own abusive husband a couple of years earlier with the hopes of moving on in her life and providing something better for her kids. So it makes sense that she would try and talk some sense into Marilyn, a new friend, just based off of her own experience, and that maybe Marilyn took the advice and told Marty she was leaving. It also makes perfect sense that he would have been extremely angry about that and would have blamed Sue for Marilyn leaving and not his own violence and abusive behaviors. According to this random counselor, with no reason to lie, at the Veterans Administration, Marty said that he, quote, obviously couldn't allow Sue to live, end quote, after she had talked Marilyn into leaving him, and so he went over to the cabin and attacked her. The counselor immediately reported this information to the police right when Marty confessed it, very close to the time of the murders, shortly after they had taken place, but the police never logged the information or investigated it any further. A few years after the murders, Marilyn Smart, so Marty's then estranged wife, said she had found Tina's jacket in her basement and that it had been covered in blood, and she also said she had turned that evidence over to the police early on in the investigation. No one knows what to make of that, because if she did turn that evidence in, it was also never logged, and investigators from that time refused to acknowledge that that evidence ever existed. So basically, the original investigators say that they never received a jacket, and for whatever reason, Marilyn is either lying or mistaken. Right, because that's something you become very confused about and don't remember every single detail of for the rest of your life. In a documentary made in 2008 about the murders, Marilyn was interviewed, and she said she believed Marty had perpetrated the crimes wholeheartedly, and she admitted he had confessed to her in a letter. In the letter, Marty said, quote, I paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we're through? Great. What else do you want? End quote. The police were made aware of the letter. They saw the letter, but they never took it as evidence or logged it either. At the time of the murders, a friend of Marty's was living with him in Maryland, and that friend was a man named John Bubiday. And he had moved in with the couple after only having known Marty for a couple of weeks. They'd met 2 weeks before the murder happened while John was receiving treatment for PTSD at a nearby Veterans Administration hospital. So Marty wasn't only going to therapy or counseling at the one in Reno once he moved after the murders, but he was also attending somewhere near Keddie while he lived there too. I mention that just so you're aware that this wasn't the same place in Reno where he confessed after the murders, because he'd only moved there afterwards and had to have been attending nearby at the time the murders happened. John Bubiday was called Bo, and on the night of the cabin murders, he, Marilyn, and Marty had been out drinking together at a local bar. Once the 3 of them went home, Bo and Marty returned to the bar later on, and when they did so, they really stood out to everyone because they were in this local small-time bar, and at that point, once they went back, they were dressed to the nines wearing really nice suits. It was described as though they were looking like they had spent time that day or that evening at some sort of business function, but really, people speculate now in hindsight that they were merely trying to get people to notice and remember that they were there so that they could establish an alibi early on. Bo was interrogated after the murders, and he told the police that he had been a police officer himself in Chicago for 18 years. However, upon further investigation, the authorities determined that wasn't true at all, and he had never worked anywhere for any law enforcement agencies. He also lied about how long he had lived in Keddie, and he told them Marilyn was his niece, which was another lie. Many people talked about how Bo had a crush on Sue and that she had rejected his advances at least twice, and that he hadn't been too happy about it. Despite all the lies he told, all of the inconsistencies in his story, Bo was immediately cleared as a suspect by investigators, and he was never questioned again after that one and only time right then in the beginning. Later on, investigators found that Bubiday had a criminal record and had worked for the Chicago Mafia as an enforcer. He had been cooperating with the Department of Justice as an informant, and when I heard that, the whole reason for the cover-up came perfectly and blindingly into the light for me. The local authorities either took it upon themselves or were pressured by the DOJ not to arrest this man, even though it was obvious he was either involved or really hiding something. That's just my opinion though, but a light bulb did go off in my head with that one, and it all started to make sense why the cops ignored all of the evidence and refused to get involved with arresting Bubiday or Marty. I'm not the only one who suspects this is what happened, though, and it's been long rumored that his cooperation with the DOJ out of Chicago was the reason the DOJ in Sacramento stopped the investigation into the Keddie murders involving these guys very early on. There's no information out there about what links Bo to the mafia in Chicago, but the information is out there nonetheless, and when they came from Sacramento to talk to Bo, they didn't send homicide investigators. They sent organized crime investigators. What I mean by it's not out there, I mean I can't find it on the internet, but that it is in the official paperwork that he does have these connections and mob ties out of Chicago. The question here is, were the authorities protecting a confidential informant? In my opinion, they definitely were, and this is just how things worked back in the 80s, and sometimes they still work this way today. Unfortunately, it's something that I see a lot when it comes to these investigations, but especially back in the day. The sheriff being a close and personal friend of Martin Smart probably didn't help matters either for anyone actually looking for justice for this family. John Bubiday left Keddie right after the murders and moved back to Chicago, where he died in 1988. In 2013, the Plumas County Sheriff Greg Hagwood hired a special investigator named Mike Gamberg to investigate the Keddie cabin murders case. Gamberg had been a rookie investigator back in 1981 when the murders happened, and he hadn't been involved in the investigation at all at any point. Since he was put on the case in 2013, he has made many new discoveries. The first thing I want to discuss here is the anonymous phone call made to the authorities that told them the skull fragments and the portion of the mandible found belonged to Tina, even though the authorities hadn't yet made any connections between the finding of those remains and the disappearance and murders in Keddie years earlier. They probably never would have connected it because they weren't thinking along those lines, not until at least 2013, maybe. The audio recording of that 911 anonymous call was located at the bottom of an unopened evidence box. He immediately sent the tape out to other law enforcement agencies to see if any new evidence could come from it or if they could help with any new leads at that point related to it. In 2016, a man was sweeping around the entrance of the Keddie cabin community with a metal detector, and he came upon that hammer in a dried-up pond right near there. It matched the description of the one Marty had said went missing from his home right before the murders during his one and only interrogation. Sheriff Hagwood doesn't believe it ended up there by accident, and he believes that someone had purposely thrown it into the pond back at the time of the murders. The area was an actual pond back in 1981, and it had just dried up by the time the metal detector guy was there in 2016 and found it. The sheriff also discovered a hunting knife underneath some junk piles in Keddie and sent that for further analysis as well. Then, in 2018, the sheriff matched some DNA that had been lifted from the murder scene to, quote, a living suspect, end quote. No names have ever been released to the public, though, and no arrests have ever been made. We don't know who these still living suspects are. This confused me because though all of the articles I've read during my research into this stated that there were numerous suspects in the case, they only ever talk about Marty and Bo, and I've not come across another name as far as suspects go in this case. We know that Marty died in the early 2000s and Bo passed away in Chicago in 1988, so who was still alive in 2018? And why hadn't they ever been arrested if they were a suspect initially and their DNA was found at the scene all those years ago, or found on either the knife and or the hammer in 2016 and 2018. It doesn't make sense, but that's only because no names besides those two were ever made public. Sheriff Gamberg said that it's possible 6 people were involved in the murders. So we know 2 who died, leaving 4 possible suspects. And to those that are still alive, Gamberg made a public statement to them saying, quote, they better batten down the hatches because we're coming. We're continuing with the investigation and we're doing interviews and we have several persons of interest, end quote. The results of the DNA analysis and all the tests aren't known to the public. And as far as the person who eventually ended up picking John and Dana up hitchhiking that night, because if you remember, there was someone that was like, oh, I saw them. How do we know they weren't involved? Well, Sheriff Gamberg said he identified a woman and he did interview her. She's been cleared as a suspect and had just been a good Samaritan giving the boys a ride home. That just about sums it up, but I do want to discuss a couple of other little theories here before we leave. So we have the obvious already when Marty Smart allegedly confessed to his wife leaving him because of Sue's influence. But was there anything else we might have been missing? Well, according to the Sheriff Gamberg, he believes that Marty and Sue might have been having an affair, while at the same time Sue was trying to get Marilyn to leave Marty. Possibly because she thought it was the safest thing for Marilyn and the kids, and possibly too because she wanted Marty to herself. He shares part of this theory with the owner of Keddie28.com, a man who goes by the name of GMAC. However, GMAC stopped short of believing Sue was trying to get Marilyn to leave Marty at all. There are some investigators who believe that Marilyn herself was complicit in the murders because it's possible she learned about the affair between her husband and Sue Sharp. For instance, in Marty's letter to Marilyn, he asked, quote, "What else do you want?" end quote, seemingly as though he's asking her what she wants in addition to what he had already given her and done for her. The day after the murders, Marilyn moved out of cabin 26, which is kind of odd when you think about it, though she could have just been in fear of her life at that point and for the life of her children, knowing such a brutal and grisly murder had happened right across the little lane from where they were living. But if she was being honest about having found Tina's blood-soaked jacket and handing it in, who did she think she was escaping from? Because at that point, she would have known who the killer was, her own husband, and she also knew he left and took off to Reno at that point, right? Through the years, the Keddie community fell into disrepair, and Cabin 28 was demolished completely in 2004, and since then, the entire site has been abandoned. That's all I have for you today, guys. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the content, if you enjoyed hanging out with me, and if you enjoyed hanging out with one another in the premiere. Sorry if I'm a little jumpy and all over the place. I did this video in a little bit different format than what I normally do, and I did that for a reason. It's like to show you guys why a lot of the times it's, you know, it's gotten wrong. People get it so wrong on YouTube or on the internet, and that's because, like, I went to an extremely reputable source for the first part of this video, but they just didn't dive deep enough, and they leave you with all of these questions. And I was just going to do that overview, and then I was like, I cannot possibly not look into this, and if I'm looking into it already, I may as well share it with the gemstones. So as I already said, I will not be in afternoon talk on April 2nd, and there will be no pre-recorded uploads on April 8th, the following Monday from when y'all are watching this. This video will remain public for only 24 to 26 hours, and then it will become a members only video. Please be sure to look into membership if that's something you think you can afford. $4.99 a month is the least, the lowest tier, and I really have all the tiers combined right now, and I'm not really doing much because I don't have enough members to do things like live streams and special oracle reads and things like that. As soon as I start getting more members and bringing more of the money in, then I'll be able to do things like little things for your birthday and all that types of good stuff. So please be sure to share this video, okay? Spread the love by sharing the video. Subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure the notification bell for all is turned on so you don't miss any of my uploads at all. Check out the description box for some important links, ways to donate to the channel, PayPal, Cash App, my Amazon wish list gift link. Also, email me, GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com with your own paranormal, supernatural, extraterrestrial, and other worldly encounters. I really do appreciate those. I'll be putting them in my Campfire Stories volumes. I want to do 12 of those. There's 2 out there already. Or I'll just put them in listener encounters if you want to discuss anything else. Questions, comments, concerns, respectful complaints, you can just email me, GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. The links for all of my books on Amazon, Kindle, paperback, and Audible are also in the description box, as well as the schedule for the week on this channel. There are a lot of live streams, not just these 2 pre-recorded uploads. I really do need a break. I'm not usually this fumbly and mumbly and bumbly over my words. It's just been a long few months. I haven't really taken a break in a while. Since I don't think like Christmas break when my son had, the 10 days for Christmas. So I am looking forward to relaxing, but I'll still be here. I'll still be working on my new book, Gone Mysterious Disappearances, where I take extremely strange disappearances and put a paranormal and supernatural spin on them. Not to be disrespectful, just to be more realistic. I know that a lot of the time there is a supernatural, paranormal, or otherworldly reason why these people are going missing the way they are. Whether others want to acknowledge that or not, that's their prerogative, but it is what it is, and I know what I know. Be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything. Be kind to yourselves, and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. If nobody told you today, you're beautiful, you're amazing, you got this. Just keep being positive, keep going with the flow, and never give up. I believe in you. I got you back. Always go in grace, smile at a stranger, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.